wanted to use
really sure.
Welcome to CP Insider. I'm Morgan Lee. Today I'm joined by Boz Tchividjian. He is the Executive Director of GRACE, Godly Response to Abuse in a Christian Environment. It's an organization which helps Christian organizations and churches address sex abuse. Boz, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
I'm wondering if you can talk about how this became a passion of yours and something that you wanted to found an organization to address.
Sure. Didn't know too much about abuse within the church, especially sexual abuse within the church growing up. But my first job after coming out of law school was as a prosecutor. And it's during those days as a prosecutor where I encountered firsthand addressing issues of sexual abuse, especially child sexual abuse, and I saw the devastation that horror affected not only upon victims but families, and oftentimes many of my cases in some way, shape, or form were connected in some way to the church. So when I got out of prosecuting, one of the things that God put on my heart was to go take what I'd learned in the trenches as a prosecutor and to go train and equip his church to understand this issue much better in order so that it could take steps to better protect little ones, but also take steps to serve and love those who'd been abused as children, survivors who've made their ways inside the church. And more often than not, we just don't serve that population well, and oftentimes they end up leaving the church. So that's when Grace was sort of put on my heart, and was able to be introduced to some experts around the country, all who love the Lord and all who had the same burden to train and equip Christ's church to better understand this issue. And that's 2004 we formed Grace.
So sex abuse in general is something that's very horrifying and dark to talk about, but I'm sure when you're talking about churches, it can even get darker and more secretive and kind of have this even more frustrating element because of the expectations that we have for what churches are. Can you describe some of the stuff that you began to find as you were doing research about religious institutions and sex abuse and cover-ups for that matter?
I think ultimately there's just an incredible amount of silence about this issue. You know, if you go back to Old Testament, remember David's daughter was raped by her brother, and when she goes and tells her brother Absalom about it, Absalom's first statement is, "Be quiet, for he is your brother." So be quiet, don't tell anybody. King David, when he learns about it, he gets upset but doesn't do anything. Well, in the thousands of years of the church, not much has changed. We are telling victims every day to be quiet. We don't want this to surface. We are going to somehow hurt or tarnish the gospel or the reputation of Jesus if we talk about something like this. And I'm like, no, Jesus is all about truth. Jesus is all about bringing this stuff to the surface and not hiding it. And so one of the things we try to do with Grace is help the church understand what is a gospel-centered response to abuse. And a gospel-centered response to abuse is that, look at what God did. God, in the face of evil, didn't stand silent, but he actually expended himself through his son to death for us. What are we doing as a church to expend ourselves in service for those in our midst who have suffered greatly as children? I believe if we began to actually live that out and to do it transparently, I think survivors would find the church to be a much safer place, and I think they would actually find the church to be the place that they run to instead of away from.
So sometimes, and all too often, right, church leaders themselves are accused of abusing children or of taking advantage of them. And in those instances, oftentimes people will look at those religious leaders and say that there's no way that someone would have done that, or that someone's trying to slander them or hurt their reputation. So how do you deal with the rumors or gossip or conversation that starts to come out after these initial accusations are made? And what advice do you give to congregations when they're dealing with all of this?
Well, the first advice is when you learn of that type of allegation being made, you need to make sure that it's reported to law enforcement.
Okay.
Make sure that law enforcement does the investigation. We are not trained in the church or equipped or authorized to do those investigations. God has given us the civil authorities to engage those investigations. So report it. So oftentimes I encounter churches who think they can handle these situations themselves, and every single time they blow it. Every single time. And as a result, when they blow it, the offender is protected because he ends up being able to continually have access to children, and oftentimes the victims are re-traumatized. So that's one. First and foremost, report the allegation. Second of all, to understand and acknowledge that those who hurt children are some of the most deceptive individuals on the face of the earth. One time I had a friend that said, it's not the guy sitting in the corner of the party that you should be all alone, that you should be concerned about. It's the one who's hosting the party. And so we have to get rid of this notion that this nice person, this likable person would never be capable of doing this type of offense. I have a good friend of mine that said, niceness is not a character trait. We have to begin to understand what that means, and to understand that oftentimes offenders consciously choose to be nice because that's how they gain access and trust of those around them. But we are too still often thinking that the offenders that want to hurt our children are the creepy guys in the park that you want to stay away from. Most offenders are people that the child knows. In fact, most of those who harm children are family members, and we need to begin to train the church to understand that, so that when these allegations are made, they don't automatically play judge and jury and say, this guy, there's no way this guy did this child's lying. If they knew a little bit more about this issue and were educated, they wouldn't jump to those conclusions and actually would take steps to protect not only that child, but the other children in the midst.
Boz, I'm really glad that you could talk to us and kind of just jumpstart this conversation. And you have a blog where readers can find out more about all this type of stuff. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Hope we can have some more conversations.
I absolutely do too. For CP Insider, I'm Morgan Lee, and we'll see you next time.